Okay, hello everybody. At least only half an hour it took to get all the hardware and software to work. Um, well, that's a pity, but almost every lecture hall in our university is different. So it's always a hard task to get it be done in our digitalized world. Anyway, so we are at the topic of the neoclassical theory, and the first time we have seen in theory the neoclassical explanation. This was this long run um, supply curve, and now we want to go into more detail what is behind this vertical supply curve. And for this, we started last time with the labor market that we have, oops, derived from the assumption of profit maximization and fully competitive markets, so that now prices are fully flexible, which on the other hand means that every economic agent has to take prices as given, because, for example, if I am a supplier and I want to increase prices, then we as demanders just go to the neighbor who is supplying the same good for a lower price. So I have to take the price in the market as given when I'm profiting when I'm maximizing my profit, and in the other way around, when I'm doing my utility maximization as a demander and I am starting to bargain with a supplier, then he said, and I say, well, can you give me this bread not for 2 euros, but for 1 euro and 80 cents? Then the provider of the bread would say, well, I can also wait for another demander because he will pay or she will pay the higher price. Okay, so from this, we obtained that the traditional optimality condition, that we have the value of the marginal product of our input factor, in this case labor, has to be equal to the price of this input factor. So in this case, just the wage rate. And due to the assumptions on the neoclassical production function, first derivative positive, second derivative negative, we obtain here the first derivative depending on the labor input on L has to be a constant number. So if we increase this constant, so increasing the wage rate would then mean that we have to decrease the labor input, since we know that the first derivative of the first derivative, which is the second derivative of the original function, is negative, so that we have an inverse dependence. And from this, then we obtain our classical result. The higher the wage rate, the less people will be hired by the enterprises. And we also derived this graphically, that we said, well, profit is just revenue minus costs, and that the revenue or real output is just given by our right-banded neoclassical production function, and costs is just a linear line with a slope of with the slope equal to the wage rate. So the maximum distance between these two curves we of course find when the two slopes are coinciding, and this again means marginal product equals the price of the input factor. And if we then increase the wage rate. This will be translated in our diagram into a right band of the cost curve or the cost linear line, and therefore we move to the left with our optimum labor demand, and again we obtain this negative dependence of labor on the wage rate. And then oops, where is it? We moved to the labor supply, and there at first I introduced just the household optimum, where you have derived the optimal demands for some goods given some budget. And the optimal condition was just the slope of the indifference curve, which is the marginal rate of substitution, has to be equal to the slope of the budget line, and the slope of the budget line is just the price ratio. And then I showed you that for the derivation of labor supply, we have a technically totally similar optimization problem, since we assume that we also have, so to speak, two goods, spare time and consumption. And now we have two restrictions, which we in the second step have been consolidated, that we want to have spare time and we want to consume, but when we consume, we have to work in order to earn some money. And oops, did I start the recording? Hopefully. Yes, okay. And that every hour which I work, I cannot be at the beach, so I have to reduce my spare time. And that all my wage earnings, W times L, I'm going to spend for consumption PC. And also I have my time restriction, that I have a budget of time, let's say 16 hours per day, because 8 hours of the day I have to sleep. And with the 16 hours, I can just choose between working and spare time. And taking these two conditions together, I obtained that my overall time is given, of course, equal to my spare time plus, and now 1 over the real wage, 1 over real wage times consumption. And that then I can say, okay, I have my utility function, which is just depending on two goods, x1 and x2, or in my case, C and F, subject to a restriction, which is just a linear restriction, where I can interpret the 1 in front of F as the price of spare time. So spare time is somehow in my model now the numerator. And the price of consumption is given by 1 over the real wage. And that then my condition from the household optimum, marginal rate of substitution, equals price ratio P1 over P2, just translates into marginal rate of substitution is 1 over real wage, but 1 over real wage translates into the inverse, so marginal rate of the substitution equals the real wage. And the cut on the vertical axis, M over P1 and P2 in the household optimum, in our case, translates just into overall time budget. Of course, the maximum time I can spend at the beach is that I sit the overall 16 hours at the beach, or the maximum what I can consume is working the whole time. So real wage times working the whole time, real wage times L bar is the cut of the vertical axis. And then we ask ourselves what happens now if the wage is increasing. This moves up this vertical cut. And then we know that we, within this region, in the so to speak better set, that somewhere there has to be the new optimum. And then we argued, well, it could be rationally the case that although the wage is increased, I decrease my working time. Because why? Maybe I'm already satisfied with my former consumption level. So earning a higher wage rate would now mean I can consume the same level with less work. There we argued these preferences will be found maybe around in in the part of the society where I have the richer people, because they already have almost everything they want. And on the other hand, I can also argue, well, now I can substitute, since the wage rate has increased, spare time with work, and relatively I can now additionally more consume than before, and that therefore I have an incentive to increase my work. And there we argued then that this so-called substitution effect will be larger than this formerly argued income effect, especially in the part of the society where I have the poorer people. And then we are in macroeconomics, we have to aggregate it. Well, on average, what will be now true? Income effect is larger or substitution effect is larger. And for this, we looked at the general income distribution in a developed economy. And there we have to admit that the number of quite rich people is much less than the poorer people in our society. And from this empirical, and this you have to keep in mind, this is only an empirical argumentation. This comes not from the general utility maximization argument. This is then what we find from empirics, that it is a, so to speak, good assumption that on average the substitution effect will be larger than the income effect. But if you ask yourself, for you, always it can be possible that you would say, if your manager is coming to you and, well, he offers you 10% higher wage rate, and he has the idea, oh, hopefully then he will or she will work more, that you say, well, I'm happy. Now I start to reduce my work. So from this empirical fact, then we can derive this positive dependence of labor supply on the wage rate. So this comes, let's do it in green. Oops, where is it? This is an empirical assumption. Oh. Then we have to like this, this. Okay, and now we can go a little bit faster through the next argumentation because now we switch to the capital market, and there you will directly see that again the argumentation is totally the same relative to the labor market. Capital supply. Capital demand we had already. Yes. Okay. So capital demand. Capital supply, we are deriving from the so-called intertemporal consumption problem. Intertemporal consumption optimization. Again, we assume that we have, so to speak, two goods. The goods are now C1, C2, and C1 and C2 is consumption today and consumption tomorrow. So C1, consumption today, and C2, consumption tomorrow. And now remember the circular flow where we have the sector of the households. And there we had all the inflows, the income from the enterprise, the income from government, income from credits. And that we said, well, a household has a very central decision to make how much I want to consume today and how much I want to save today. Why I'm saving? Well, I'm saving because I want to consume tomorrow. Let's say every month I have free capital of around 1,500 euros. Then maybe you are spending every month 1,200, 1,300 euros for eating, for holidays, for anything. And you put every month 200 euros away because you want to make a large journey in 2 years or something like this. You are saving. You are saving for consumption tomorrow. So we have also our today's budget. And in this case, we assume that we only have a today's budget and that overall consumption tomorrow has to be financed via our savings today. So M is our budget today, C1 is consumption today, and S is our savings today. So M, today's budget, and S, savings today. And now we are somehow again in macroeconomics. What kind of view on our economy is behind that you have not an additional budget M2, so to speak, in the future? This means we look at the general time when we are working. This is roughly from 20 to 65, 40, 45 years. And then we have a period where we have where we have been retired, where we have to finance our consumption because we have saved something in our working period. This is a so-called overlapping generations model, that we just divide our overall living time into a time where we are working and a time where we have been retired and where we not working anymore. Okay, and then here's the one missing. Still, we have no consumption tomorrow. So, what are we doing with our savings? And we are in the capital supply question. With our savings, we are going to the capital market, and at the capital market, we are earning an interest for our savings. So over time, to the next period, to tomorrow, we have not only the savings, we have 1 plus the interest rate times our savings volume, which we can consume then tomorrow. So I is the interest rate and multiplying our savings volume with the interest rate factor 1 plus I is then what we have in the future to consume. Okay, and now let's also consolidate these two conditions. So our general problem is now maximize utility depending on C1, C2, subject first to M equals C1 plus S, and the second condition subject to 1 plus I times S equals C2. Let's solve this for C2. Not for C2, it is already solved for C2. Let's solve this for S. So dividing by the interest rate factor, 1 plus I. This means S equals 1 over 1 plus I times C2. Now we can put S into the first condition. So we obtain M equals, and again I write a 1 in front of C1. In a minute you see why I do this again. 1 times C1 plus, and now 1 over 1 plus I times C2. Max U of C1, C2. And now I have only one condition. Let's compare this. With our household problem, x1, x2, subject to m equals p1, c1, x1, sorry, plus p2, x2. And again, I see x1 coincides with c1, x2 with c2, m with m, P1 with 1, X1, C1, P2 with 1 over the interest rate factor, and X2 with C2. Hopefully, you again see the total symmetry to the labor market, where we have in the same way argued with respect to the spare time consumption restriction. Well, and now we can just translate the optimal condition from the household optimum budget line now is given. What would be the total possible value of consumption today? Can you help me? What I have to write down at the horizontal cut of my budget line. At this point, what I have to write down here. This would be the maximum value which I can consume today. Any idea? These are my restrictions. Anybody? Yep. This I have already done here. This is you really have to start to learn into these letters. I cannot always say, well, let's say our budget is 1,000 euro. And if you have a budget of 1,000 euro, what is the maximum you can spend for consumption? If you have 1,000 euro, 1,000 euros. But if 1,000 euros are M, then it is M, of course. Yeah. Please really start to learn this. I know that we do not, yeah. Provide this in school. I don't know why we have changed this 30 years ago. All young people, children had to learn this, and they have learned this. I don't know why we have skipped this. Because if I have always to do an example with a special number, then you will never learn the theory behind it. Then you always think, well, I have to think in an example. This takes so much time that, of course, the artificial intelligence will be better than you. You can use AI if you have in mind what it is all about. How is the model functioning? If you know this, then you can use the artificial intelligence, and then you will be much faster. But for this, you have to understand what you are talking about. So this will be M. What is the maximum value I can consume tomorrow? So which number I have to put at the vertical axis? Yep. Yes, of course, plus the interest rate. 1 plus I times M. Well, and if you remember from the household theory, there you had M over P1 and M over P2. M over P1, P1 is 1, 1, M over 1 is of course M. M over P2 on the vertical axis. P2 is 1 over 1 plus I. M over 1 plus I is of course then M times the inverse 1 plus I times M. But of course you, as your colleague said, you can also directly think economically. Well, what does this cut mean? Maximum value of C2, and then also, of course, you directly know. Then you do not have to argue formally. You just say, well, if I save 100%, then out of my savings tomorrow there will be 1 plus I times the savings volume, and this will be my maximum value for C2. And then again, indifference curve with a slope equals to the slope of our budget line is marginal rate of substitution equals to P1 over P2. P1 is 1. P2 is 1 over 1 plus I. So 1 over 1 plus I. And this means 1 plus I. So this is my optimal condition. And now, well, I want to derive capital supply. So how depends capital supply on a change on interest rate? Let's do this in green. Oops. If I is increasing, so I prime larger than I. What happens in my diagram at a first step when I'm increasing the interest rate? So there again, you have to think, where do I directly find in my diagram the interest rate? Yep, here times M. So what happens with this cut here? If I prime is larger than I, if I assume that interest rates are increasing. No, you don't have more budget. M is not increasing. M is still the same number. But yeah, yes, not the function, the point. The point shifts up, yeah? Because M down here is not increasing. This stays the same. So I obtain maybe up here a new cut on the vertical axis. There you have really to be careful in your argumentation. Well, I think when I'm talking here to you that you are meaning the right things, yeah? But you are formulating it not in the right way. And in 2 weeks, you have to write an exam. And then I read what you have written. And then I cannot directly ask, have you meant the right thing? You have written down something wrong. Yeah? I cannot look in your eyes. And here I have seen, well, he is meaning the right thing. But if then I read the budget has increased, Then I have a question mark in my face. Then I ask, well, okay. So in theory, you have to be really careful. From the first thing, the second thing has to follow, the third thing, and so on. You have to argue in a logical way. This I see is also not, this we also do not do in school anymore. The children are writing something, and then you get a good mark for this. Then I think, okay, what will be later on in the labor market? There you have to be successful. You are competing with all the people around the world. And right now in Europe, we see that we are maybe in some sectors not anymore the best in the world. This is quite hard for us to learn in Europe, but it is the case. Especially people in India and Southeast Asia. Take the electronic sector. "90% of the high-performance chips worldwide are produced in Taiwan." So everybody in the world is looking at this little country because everything's what you have here, your laptops, your tablets, your your handies, e-mobility, smart grid, anything is depending on these artificial intelligence. Everything is depending on this high performance chips, which are produced in this little country in the world. Okay, so let's go back. So we obtain here, this is not very good drawn, up, up. We have now a new budget line. Can. No, somehow. Okay, let's do it like this. So again, now within this part here, we are in the beta set. We can move outward our indifference curve. But where we find it, we don't know. This again depends on how does our preferences look like. So again, compared to the labor market, the new optimum could be here and the new optimum could be here. In this case, compared to our starting optimum level, L star of I, we can, or not L, this is C1, sorry. Oops, C1. In this case, on the right side, we are increasing today's consumption. Although the interest rate has increased, although it is more attractive to save, but again, the argumentation could be, I have a today's savings decision, putting from my 1,500 euros 200 away, and maybe this consumption level which this creates for tomorrow is already enough for me. If now the interest rate is increasing, this means I have to put today less away, maybe only 180 euros. And since due to an increase of the interest rate, this provides me the same possible value for consumption in the future. This then would mean this is argumentation where this income effect in my preferences is quite large, that although the interest rate has increased, I decrease my savings. Or the other way around, the new optimum could also be possibly on the left. Then, due to my preferences, the argumentation that now it is more attractive due to the substitution effect, due to a higher interest rate, to save today more. Because for every saved euro today, I earn more in the future, so I can relatively consume more in the future. And if this argumentation for me is larger, then I will move with my new optimum to the left. So in this case, again, the substitution effect is larger than the income effect. And in this case, the income, the income effect, and here also the income effect is larger. This is another thing. Mm. I've talked about this technical problem, I think 3 years ago, that you are not using the PC in the room and the people, and you are not here in the room, are not very, and not many people, that then after half an hour, the beamer is switching off. Well, nothing changes. Anyway, so again, we have to ask what is true on average because we are in macroeconomics. Both argumentations are logic and both argumentations are possible within our general framework of utility maximization. And again, we look at our income distribution. Number income, let's say here 100,000 euros per year. Then we see roughly this kind of income distribution in a country. Average or median income per head in Germany is roughly 40,000 euros. And then we argue again, well, the consumption level of tomorrow with my today's savings volume will be generally then already enough for the richer people. And especially if we look at poorer people, then quite often they even have not a very large possibility to save anything. So they will react, yeah, or they really will react if the interest rates are increasing. Then they think, oh, now I can really shift some capital into the future. There will be something in the future. So again, for poorer people, substitution effect will be larger than income effect, and then on average we obtain k of I is positively depending on interest rates, or looking at this, we obtain k of I the other way around. We're putting this capital on the horizontal axis. Capital interest rates, a positive function. Well, and now we have everything together. We have the labor market, we have the capital market, labor, we have labor demand, capital demand, labor supply, and capital supply. And then we obtain for the capital market capital supply, capital demand, equilibrium interest rate, equilibrium level of capital, and for the labor market we obtain from labor supply and labor demand the equilibrium wage rate and the equilibrium level of labor. So the savings take some time. No. Well, and then we can ask now ourselves, in general, we would need now also a view on the commodity market. So how much are we producing? And now we take the so-called Walras law from Leon Walras. He is maybe a very annoying guy for you because in the 19th century, maybe he was the starting guy who started the mathematization of economics. He was a professor of economics in Lausanne, in Switzerland, and he, yeah, examined especially the topic of general equilibrium, or even he introduced this concept of general equilibrium. So if we look at one single market, then we know, of course, and in our case, especially with capital and labor, we need these two levels in order to produce later on. So, and then his argumentation was, well, we have many, many different markets in our economy, and all these markets are interacting. And that then, in the end, if we have found the equilibrium for almost all markets due to the price mechanism, and we are left only with one single market, then then the last market which we see, since every markets are depending on each other, that then also the last market has to be in equilibrium. And this is called the law of Walras because he was the first one who has rigorously formulated this. And I think it is also quite intuitive. We have assumed that the main input factors for production are labor and capital. And if we know from utility maximization and profit maximization the equilibrium levels of capital and labor, then we can feed these two in our production function equals A times F of K star L star. That then this means, okay, these two levels define also the equilibrium production level. And this we call then Y star. And then we end up at the starting point of our lecture today, because then we can go to the commodity market having now from the other two markets determined the equilibrium production level. We see now within these two markets there we have no commodity price level there. That this then translates into this vertical supply curve, depending on prices and output. And this is then Y star, or in our ASAT model, YS, the long run supply curve. And from our Keynesian theory, this I will provide in this diagram too, we had derived our demand function at the commodity market YD or AD, and this was derived from the ISLM model. So because of this, we do not have to go additionally go through all the optimization program for the commodity market, because due to Walras law, this market has directly also to be in equilibrium. Has to be in equilibrium due to Walras law. And the last thing for today is now we are in this supply side explanation of the economy. And this supply side view was also formulated by a guy, Jean-Baptiste Zaï, where I have him here. It was a French economist in the 18th, 19th century, and he has formulated the functioning of the economy in the following way. He said that we can purchase something, that we can demand something, depends always on the ability that we have already produced something. So production is the first thing in our explanation for the economy. So this means every supply creates its own demand. Every supply creates its own demand. This is maybe somehow a little bit surprising, because if you think about your marketing lectures or something, then you said, well, we at first always have to make a market analysis. What is the demand structure in the market? What could be a successful product? But think of the time when this guy has lived, around 1800, beginning of the 19th century. What kind of historical period was there, especially in Europe, in Germany, in France, in the United Kingdom, where these ideas have developed? What kind of period was it? And maybe then such a view on the economy is maybe then reasonable. You have an idea? Yes, of course. This is the period of the Industrial Revolution in Europe. Period of Industrial Revolution. 18th, 19th century. Well, and in this time, there was this great change. Think of my starting point in the lecture. There we had the circular flow, and where I introduced it in the 17th century in Europe. There, the main production sector in the countries was just the agricultural sector. Because why? Well, the main task was that the people are not starving of hunger, that they really have to eat something tomorrow. And then the invention of the steam machine and all the other technical things in the 18th, 19th century, then we just started to produce all our consumption goods. Until this time, there were not many of these, so to speak, modern consumption goods. So then we had all these new ideas. One example which I give at this point in the lecture is I think Coca-Cola was invented in the 1870s, something around this. Of course, the guys, they didn't have made some market analysis. Is there a demand for a very sweet drink? They just have invented it, and then the demand was there because also the people had some money to buy such a sweet drink. 200 years before this time, they could only drink water because nobody had money to really think ourselves, well, I could also drink something else than water. No, there was no possibility. But now we had this increase of incomes, and then we could really start to ask ourselves, I can also start to consume something else than the next lunch. And so, in this period of this industrial revolution, where more or less every day there was an invention of a new product, and the people just started to buy it. And so he said, argued, how is the economy working? Well, we are starting to produce. When we are producing, then this generates income. One part, think of GDP, the distribution side. One part of the income is the labor income. The other part of the income is the capital income. And with this income, I can start to buy something, so I can demand something. And so in this case, in this argumentation starts the circle of our economy. Or let's put it like this. So this would be the production side, the starting point. This generates the income. Then we have this income for the household. And there is our consumption saving decision. We are consuming all the products which has been provided by the enterprises. With our savings, we are going to the capital markets, and generally in the capital markets, the demand for the investment goods is created. And again, these investment goods are provided by the enterprises. So, to speak, the economy works in this direction, starting from the enterprise sector. Okay, then, since I have to go to the Senate, this is it for today. And tomorrow we will then do the last step. So, putting all what we have theoretically learned together in a really loved quadruple plot by the students. So then, see you tomorrow.